We have here Amelia Andersdotter from the European Parliament. She is the youngest member of the European Parliament, if I'm right. And she had a very interesting introduction to the plenary, to digital citizenship. And I would like to just go back and a little bit ask you again about this geographical way of citizenship and the way that we have today in terms of internet and new media and young people. It's changing to a major extent. What do you think about all this, and what's your opinion that you also represent in the parliament?
Well, I think it's not actually very mystical, like, because it's so easy to communicate, and especially over far distances, we can communicate in many different ways, through voice and video and text, through music, through culture, very, very quickly with almost anyone, anywhere in the world. It makes perfect sense that we would have now people lining up more according to maybe hobbies and interests, rather than according to their geographical identity, like their geographical community. So rather than only having as your basis for social interaction in your school or your workplace or the people you would meet face to face in your day-to-day life, you also now have a significant amount of the shaping of our identities actually occurs in this other interaction space, which isn't as dependent on place. And this isn't, I mean, what could you say more than this? It poses challenges to the legislatory regimes and to the regulatory regimes that we're applying to our societies, because they're largely based around the nation state. It also poses a challenge to how we think about maybe regulating and making legislation for the interaction spaces that are actually being used. So when I hear talks about digital citizenship, for instance, very often they are focused on human rights. I know the Swedish government has made several relatively actually friendly statements in favor of human rights on the internet in the context of the Human Rights Council, but we know at the same time that a lot of the infrastructure that is being used and a lot of the platforms that are being used are actually private, and this would then merit that we instead look at ways of having society interact with the private platforms, right? Like, how do we relate to the private platforms? How do we regulate them in a way that this kind of multi-geographical, multi-layered interaction is made possible or made possible to continue?
And what do you think, is the digital citizenship something extensional to the normal way of citizenship? Like, many ways we are talking about European identity, which is extensional to the national identity, or do you believe in online and offline world is different, or there's just one world and online things are just the tools? We have many different things which relates to this aspect.
I don't think that you need to be exclusive in this. So, of course, online as offline, we have many different identities that we present to different people in different locations. I don't address my mom in the same way I address you, and this is very rational for me to behave this way. I don't talk in an IRC channel in the same way I would talk on my blog or on Facebook. This is also a very rational approach for me, and I think all of these kind of identities that we're having in different spaces just kind of overlap, or they're distinguished. Just like the separation between online and offline maybe isn't the most relevant distinction actually, but maybe we should base it more on the type of community we're in when we're performing the specific interaction, regardless of whether it's online or offline. I think society is more complex than that you can simply divide it into online and offline, and in fact maybe the complexity of society makes that distinction largely redundant.
And according to citizenship has like room, space, rules and framework. What the digital citizenship should be like any rules for this, if we speak about one social network which has almost 1 billion users globally, worldwide. So is then the European legislation entitled to make anything which is globally, or how to is there a need to bring all the stakeholders together and make some basic principles, like don't over-regulate the internet, or make some technical standards, like we heard in many workshops, like we have technical standards and we have censorship in many ways. So is there a need to agree worldwide on some things, or what do you think? With your background with the Pirate Party.
So on the first point, this discussion about over-regulation, I think, is quite frankly not so relevant. Nobody's talking about over-regulating anything. Over-regulation is too much regulation. This is what it says. We don't want to over-regulate. Of course we don't. We want to regulate well that which we do regulate. And it's a question of how you regulate that, of course, and at what level. Now, because our legislative institutions, normally in Europe, we have the geographical scope. We're very much tied to the geographical scope in our jurisdictions, and obviously this is also somehow what we have to work with. And in this case, I don't see any problems with Europe having high standards, for instance, for how we allow our citizens to communicate or exchange information or form identities online. This would not be a particularly big problem for me. Other countries, of course, can sign up to the high standards afterwards. We're already doing this with considerably worse stuff than protecting the freedom of communications of citizens, so I don't understand why we could also do it there. And then, of course, like the further you move the power away from the citizen, the more, like, if you put it at an international level, like with the global government, or I know that there's like this global parliament ideas floating around, it also makes it more difficult for the citizen to interact directly with their institutions. So that would be more difficult, I think, as a system to set up. My hopes for Europe at this time is that we'll be able to set high standards for how we allow users and people to control their own information flows. I think we're actually right now at a very good time in history to start this process. We've just had the first pan-European political debate where citizens tried to communicate to us in the European Parliament a lot that, listen, you're going off in the wrong direction, we don't want this, please change this and go somewhere else. And now we have the opportunity to either pay heed to those calls or not, and if we make, of course, the wise and responsible decision of allowing the citizens to interact with their legislative institutions and have a say in how society is run, then this could be a breaking point. But also it would depend a lot on the continued participation of citizens, which is very, very useful. And for this, of course, also communications technologies are a good way for people to keep in touch with their legislative institutions on Twitter or Facebook or through emails.
Next year is the European Year of Citizens or Citizenship. Could we recall for European Year of Digital Citizenship, or do you think it will be part of it? We just hear about mobility, but nothing really about participation and those kind of things we connect with digital citizenship.
Yeah, that's a very good question. A European Year of Digital Citizenship, what would this entail? Now, for the digital market, the general plans for the digital market in Europe, I'm a bit concerned that they're very, very focused on the digital inner market. Because actually, what is a digital market? It is worldwide already. We don't need to have an inner market in Europe for digital stuff. We already have a global market. Why would we limit ourselves geographically in the scope? And even if we did want to limit our geographical extension, like the geographical extension of our market, why would we choose to do so online? Couldn't we do so actually offline in that case, where we're already used to dealing with the ensuing problems, rather than imposing these weird, funny restrictions on an interaction space that most people are spontaneously already satisfied with? I would feel. Was that a bit too... maybe
general, like political, but it's okay.
It was very general. Well, so, no, essentially, so a lot of my work, of course, is done with industrial property rights and intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights are determined by their geographical jurisdiction. This means a copyright in Sweden only extends to Sweden. Now, of course, we have a number of international agreements that makes whenever a copyright is acknowledged in Sweden, it also, by extension and some conventions, need to be recognized everywhere else. This is the same for patents. They're granted inside a geographical jurisdiction. Trademarks are granted inside of a geographical jurisdiction, and they do not extend further than this. This makes them very good for border control measures. So when they say a digital inner market, of course, I would be slightly inclined to believe that they're trying to somehow restrict the passage of information from one side of the border to another side of the border, because it is effectively the only border measure that we're currently really pushing strongly for. Now, if I was the type of person who wanted border measures and felt very strongly about this, and especially this spring we've heard a lot of the colleagues in the European Parliament talk about the importance of protecting the European market, I would do so through tools that didn't interfere so much with people's private communications. And we've had those tools in the past. They weren't very popular also. The import tariffs were used for this purpose, for instance. But they were more overviewable, they had a limited scope, you could see the side effects and the damage caused by them very clearly. You could anticipate the side effects in a completely different way than we can from the very extensive intellectual property rights legislation and enforcement measures that we have today. So I would kind of question the digital inner market, I would question on these grounds that the geographical nature of intellectual property rights just, when you apply them for border control measures, which I think is part of the reason for choosing the terms digital inner market of Europe, that makes me slightly concerned, because I can easily see this having lots of repercussions in the way that we are allowed to communicate and form our identities, and I'm not very happy about that, because, and I know that there's many people who would be inclined to agree with me, the internet and communication is very important for shaping our societies and our identities. And I think in order to keep any kind of meaningful democratic debate or debate about citizens at all, we need to have those values very close to heart.